Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing achieving peak performance with Director of Sports Science for the Miami Hurricanes football program, Eric Renaghan. Learn about the data driving athletic excellence and what optimal wellness really entails. How can each of us strive to achieve our own peak performance? Diet, exercise, sleep are key, but what else can we do to level up? Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Eric Renaghan. He is a nationally recognized leader in sports science and has dedicated his career towards understanding how to optimize human physiology. We all know the basic components of wellness: sleep, diet, and exercise. But true wellness is much more complex than simply those three entities. In fact, the science dedicated to maximizing our body's functionality is at the highest level with major ramifications. As a fitness buff, I loved this interview. I'm always looking for biohacks and ways to push my personal performance to a higher level, both physically and mentally. Hearing what Eric had to say really educated me and opened up additional wellness avenues to pursue. The take-home point of this interview was clear. Our bodies are finely tuned engines. And just like an F1 race car, every little detail matters if you want to push the limits of performance. We must take the same approach to our own physiology if we want to hit top speed. Listen up as we discuss achieving peak performance. Check it out. Hey, Eric, how you doing?
How are you?
Listen, I'm very excited to have you on the podcast to talk about achieving peak performance, something that all of us, regardless of our athletic prowess, could use. So really excited to hear your insights into how we can all maximize our potential.
I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with the basics. What is the definition of peak performance? It's a term that's used often, but maybe people don't understand what exactly it entails.
Yeah, I think for me, peak performance is a state of exceptional functioning where an athlete or a normal non-athlete person achieves the maximum out of their potential in whatever activity they're really attempting to take part in.
And let's talk about, I guess many of our listeners might be saying, well, I'm not a high level athlete. I'm not playing for the Miami Hurricanes football team. But is it just for athletes or is it for all of us, regardless of what we do for a living?
I think this idea applies universally to anyone seeking, growth and improvement in whatever they're doing. I think, a lot of it has to do with taking responsibility for your life and creating a strong foundation for whatever, you would decide is your peak performance. And I think when people acknowledge that and they can shape their outcomes and really this empowers you to focus on the things that you can influence rather than the things you can't control.
Now, many people hear peak performance and they focus immediately on the physical aspect, but how much of achieving peak performance is physical versus mental?
I think it's a blend of both. I think peak performance is really that balance between mental performance and physical performance. And for example, sprinting leans more physical, where playing chess tilts more mental. And so being able to have a balance between those two is really critical. And I think the cognitive and the physical elements of performing really influence each other. And at the highest levels, performers really often experience that flow state where mental and physical aspects of performance merge. So I think it's really a combination of the two.
Let's start with the physical aspect, which is a little bit more clear. But, what type of exercise regimen would you recommend in order to achieve peak performance? Obviously, it varies depending on, again, if you're a 20-year-old Division I athlete versus a 50-year-old desk type job person. But in general, what type of exercise regimen do you recommend that most adults go on?
I think the recipe for peak performance really depends on what you're trying to excel at. And I think as you mentioned, it's incredibly personalized. And, if we think about, say, a gymnast needs completely different physical attributes than a marathon runner, right? And what works for one athlete might not work, even if they play the same sport or the same position. So when I look at training for peak performance, the factors that I consider are going to be what are the specific demands? If that's a sport, what are the specific demands of the position within that sport? And for example, I kind of talked about a couple different ones, but even in a sport like football, a lineman requires different physical capabilities than a receiver. And so, for me, it's really about what adaptations we're chasing, and are we trying to build, let's say, explosive power, endurance, mobility, injury resilience. I think all of those qualities require different training approaches, and really, I think that's where a lot of cookie cutter programs fall short. And for me, I think, a lot of people respond incredibly well to high intensity interval training, while others might get better results from steady state conditioning or cardio. So I think it's really about the adaptations you're chasing, and the activities that you're trying to excel at.
Some more basic physical fitness questions, but heavy weights, low reps versus lighter weights, higher reps. This is a common question that we get. What are the pros and cons of each, and when would you use each of these different training regimens?
Yeah, I'd say from my perspective, maximal force capabilities at low velocities are really poorly correlated with maximal force capability at high velocities. So for sport, it's really important to be strong at high velocities. For the general athlete, or the general person who's really trying to maintain health and fitness, I think it really depends on, again, kind of going back to the previous question of what are you trying to accomplish, and what is the activities demand. I think when we identify those things, we can really be a little bit more specific with those, let's say, prescriptions of high load, low intensity, or high load, high intensity, or vice versa. And I think it's really, again, it comes back to the individualization of what the person is really trying to accomplish. I would say, going, from the sporting perspective, though, high force at high velocity is, that's where the money is to be made.
So in sports, it's more about explosive power, is basically what you're going after.
I'd say it gives us the best opportunity to be successful. Yeah, if we can be as explosive as possible for as many opportunities as we can sustain that.
Let's talk about rest days that I feel are so important. And I fall prey to the belief that you're working out and you have an off day and you kind of feel lazy. You feel like you're not working out your body. And but the more you read, the more you realize that rest days are absolutely critical. What do you recommend for optimizing how you recover, and how many rest days should you have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. It's really often overlooked, right? Because we talk about training, and we talk about all of these different things we're doing to get stronger, and really rest and regeneration is where the magic really happens. And so, I think of it this way, with like training providing the stimulus for our guys, or anyone who's really trying to get better at something physical. Recovery is really where that adaptation occurs. So without adequate rest and regeneration, you're really accumulating fatigue and damage. And I think it's really important to break that down into, I would say, training intensity. So like, if we look at training intensity, higher intensity generally requires more recovery. Lower intensity exercise oftentimes doesn't require as much recovery time. So I think that's going to be the key indicator for deciding how many days you need for recovery and regeneration versus how much are we doing. I think experience levels is really critical. Beginners, so people that are just getting into training or exercise, they often need a little bit more recovery time than advanced athletes. And I think age, right? So the younger that the person, I think recovery capacity typically is a little bit quicker. As we age, we get a little bit longer in that time it takes to recover. So I really think, those are some critical pieces to guide how much recovery we need. And I think most importantly, and I think you could probably attest to this, is the overall stress levels we experience. I think cognitive stress and mental stress really impacts performance. And that could oftentimes take a lot longer to recover from than even physiological stress or stress from training. So I think those are really critical aspects to optimize recovery.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it best. We get focused on training, working out, but we don't really focus on the recovery part, which, like you said, that's where the magic happens and that's where you get gains. So I feel like anyone who wants to achieve peak performance needs to understand recovery, what their body needs, and don't feel bad about taking a couple of days off if you need it. I think that that's a very important mental aspect of training. Sticking on the recovery aspect, how important is sleep for achieving peak performance, and what do you recommend?
I mean, I think sleep's the foundation for effective recovery. And I think the quality of your sleep architecture, the patterns and the stages of sleep that you can achieve every night really directly impacts that regenerative process and that recovery process that we're trying to utilize to get better and to really, I would say, again, going back to that word adaptation, those to create those adaptations that we're chasing. And, um, I think deep sleep, that slow wave sleep, is really critical for physical performance. And I think your body's increasing blood flow to the muscles, it's releasing growth hormone, repairing tissues. I think this is where our athletes are really urged to get into these deep sleep phases. I think that sleep architecture and that sleep hygiene, is really critical for that. And those are some of the things that we really emphasize with our athletes. But I think it really doesn't pertain just to athletes. I think that crosses the spectrum of non-athlete to athlete, because I think that the byproduct of getting into deep sleep and longer deep sleep, I think the better we are as humans.
Yeah, I think we're learning so much about sleep. And like you said, it was underappreciated before, but we're realizing that that really is going back to what you said before, where the magic happens, where you get the gains, where you get the mental clarity, where you get the energy every single day. So I couldn't be a bigger proponent of good sleep. Like you said, it's not just the number of hours, but it's that deep REM sleep where you wake up in the morning and you feel refreshed. So we've covered sleep, we've covered intensity training and what type of training to do, but let's move into diet. How important is diet for achieving peak performance, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think diet's just as important as the training program that you're engaging yourself in. I think it's absolutely essential for peak performance. I think what you eat directly impacts energy availability, your recovery capacity. Obviously, body composition is a big thing, not only for athletes but for non-athletes. And I think even more importantly, it can impact our cognitive function during activity or competition, depending on what obviously we're chasing. And I think nutrition, similar to training, is really individualized, and it depends on the activity, sport specific or non-sport specific, metabolic demands. The training phase that you're in might really be a thing to consider for athletes. So in season and off season for us really have different demands, and those different demands require different macro micronutrient breakdowns. I think obviously we have to be considerate of food affinities and individual responses to different foods and different things. So I think that's a sometimes overlooked aspect of nutrition. And I think obviously for us and for the general population, I think what are the performance goals that you have for the individual? I think it's really important to break down not only what that activity's demands might be, but what are the individual goals of an athlete or a person really engaging in this program? And I think from that perspective, we can identify a little bit more on, let's say, what are the macros and micros that need to be focused on for the, not only demand but the goal of that person.
Now, you mentioned macros, and for those who don't know the kind of nutrition game, that's the protein, the fats, the carbs. In general, I know it needs to be specific for every single person, but what is an ideal breakdown of macros, protein, fats, carbs for someone who's maybe not a D1 athlete,
Mm-hmm.
but a high functioning professional, in their 20s, 30s, 40s?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, like, so for our guys, for protein, for athletes, especially at the level that our athletes are asked to perform, and our environmental factors, in which we train, we're looking at 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight in terms of protein. I think for maybe the the general population, the healthy general population of people just engaging in physical activity, it's probably a little bit closer to 0.8 grams per kilogram. And I guess, this is a little bit more individualized answer, but that would be the range that we're looking at. For our fats, we're probably right around the 20 to 35% of our total calories range. We're looking at omega-3 fatty acids, With our athletes, we really want to prioritize healthy fats from sources like avocados, nuts if they can eat nuts, different types of fish, and our fat intake for our guys is really kind of what we describe to them as crucial for their recovery and adaptation because it supports their hormone production, and so for us, fats are critical. The carbohydrates, I think, is the one that gets a little bit most tricky depending on what time of year we're in. We're looking at probably 5 to 10 grams per kilo during intense training phases. So if it's a general population, someone might be training for a marathon or a triathlon, that probably can be pretty consistent. Strength and power athletes like our guys need around 3 to 7 grams, depending on how intense that training is. From a carbohydrate intake perspective, we're also really looking at the timing of carbohydrate intake. Around training sessions is where we're going to probably see the most significant impact on recovery and performance. So I think similar to training, the macro breakdown is really individualized, but that would be a pretty good generalization of how we describe that to our guys.
Now, what about micronutrients that definitely do not get as much attention as the macros? What are some important micronutrients that everyone needs to pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think micronutrient density is critical. I think there's a lot of people that eat healthy and have a really good diet, but often are still nutrient deficient. And a lot of these processes that our body engages in for not only cognitive health, physical health, and just overall performance, I think is really impacted by these micronutrient deficiencies. And so, one thing that we talk about a lot of times often, doesn't get addressed is hydration status. And, we're exploring things like hydrogen water. There's a really interesting website called hydrogenstudies.com that has some great information on how hydrogen water and hydrogen can reduce inflammation potentially and reduce the ability for our bodies antioxidants to take effect. I think meal timing and hydration and micronutrient intake is also really kind of strongly correlated with each other. So when are we taking certain things, and are they competing with these other micronutrients? I think that's something that's really important. So for me, there's about 4 really distinct micronutrients. One's magnesium. Magnesium glycinate is the one that we like to focus on most because it helps with that ability for vitamin D to be utilized appropriately. And we also use L-threonate, and L-threonate has shown to help with kind of that relaxation effect and really giving our like that superior bioavailability, right? When we talk about like these different micronutrients, if we're not getting them from food, how can we absorb these different micros? And so magnesium glycinate and magnesium L-threonate seem to be for us the ones that are most absorbed at that level. Vitamin D3 is really critical. It's one of our most important nutrients that we focus on with our athletes. I think that can go, again, across the spectrum from athlete to general population. It's one of the most widespread nutrients on just general health effects, in my opinion. So immunity, hormone production. As we know, it's a steroid hormone, right? So for males, it can really be a contributing factor for maintaining testosterone levels, bone health. For us, to maximize that, we have D3 with K2, and I think for the listeners, it really, I think with K2 being part of the D3 intake, it's ensuring that calcium absorption is not going into, let's say, the vascular tissue, but actually allowing for D3 to function as intended. And then I think for me, the last 2 are zinc. Again, kind of ties in with some of the things that we're looking at for immunity with our athletes and just general health, but also with the ability to, let's say, fight off colds and flu season. And as part of, one of our biggest things that go on the injury list is illness. And so throughout the season, we really want to try to mitigate that. And zinc seems to be a big player in that. And then for us, the last piece is creatine. Those are the, kind of the 4. Generally, creatine has been utilized for muscle recovery and kind of those kind of performance enhancing effects that it's widely studied for. One of the things, and I think this probably falls into a lot of your work, is the neuroprotective aspect of creatine and how we can potentially, let's say, mitigate the severity of potential subconcussive events and TBI experiences with our athletes. So we're really interested in that aspect of creatine. And I think there's probably one of the most widely studied substances in this space is creatine. And I think there's a lot more coming out on those neuroprotective qualities. So those would be my big four.
How do you recommend taking the zinc? Is that part of a multivitamin, or is there a specific zinc compound that you recommend?
So we try to give that separately. We want to balance out when we're taking that because we don't want to compete with some of the other things that we're getting from food. So we're around 20 milligrams a day. It's usually taken with food. So when our athletes are taking that, it's typically after training during lunchtime. Um, I can compete with copper, so we want to make sure that we're balancing out when we take that. But that's generally what our recommendation would be for our guys. Is, depending on when we're in the season, as far as the timing of that, lunchtime typically seems to be when we give it to our players, and that's where we get the best response.
Let's move on to the mental aspect of peak performance, which in many ways can be more complicated. How can we train to maintain motivation and focus under pressure, right? That's something I think that when you watch these athletes, and we'll go back to athletes because that's who you handle, but these these players who seem to perform their best when the game is on the line, in general, how does that translate to the general population, and how can we train to maintain that focus under pressure?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most interesting questions. For me, I think that this doesn't really specifically pertain to athletes, in my opinion. I think you know many high performers, regardless of whether it's sport or business, they harness pressure, and I think it's a source of their best work. And for me, working across multiple sports and now at the collegiate level, a lot of the top professionals, both coaching and administrative and athletes, view pressure as a privilege. And what I mean by that is that you actually have to have something worthwhile at stake to perform. And so I think that the top professionals don't really run from pressure. I think they lean into it, and this is why they do what they do, and maintaining that focus under pressure is really about a few key details. I think preparation gives confidence. I think confidence is one of the most important things to handle pressure. Um, Staying present, it prevents you from getting overwhelmed. And some of the things that we talk about not only with my staff but with our athletes is controlling your breathing and really that response to stress and pressure. And I think that is something that we can spread across multiple domains, whether it's medicine, whether it's coaching, whether it's performing. And I think those are some of the things that we really think about when we're talking about pressure. And a lot of our best performers, a lot of the best coaches I've ever worked with, they perform better when they have pressure because there's something at risk. They start seeing it as a challenge, and I think that demonstrates their ability to maintain that level of excellence, at the risk of failure.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that is Cam Ward, who I think a lot of people are putting above Shador Sanders in the draft. And one of the reasons that they're saying that is because his ability to perform under pressure, that he was amazing this past year, that he played well all year, but when it mattered, he played at an even higher level. And I think that many people look for that and they're like, how, why? And you said it best. I think pressure being a privilege is a great statement, because if you're under pressure, that means you've earned the right to be involved in something important. And I love that statement. So yeah, I think that's such a key part of performing at your peak level. Discuss how important is mindset, not only the ability to handle pressure, but when you go into an event, whether it's sports or your business, medicine, law, How key is mindset going into that on top of just the physical activity?
I mean, I think mindset it shapes our persistence through challenges, and I think our the human's natural tendency is to avoid weakness and create comfort, and we all want to feel safe, but I think that ultimately prevents growth and progress. So I think mindset's really um, a critical aspect to performing and going into, no matter whether that be sport or business or medicine or whatever the area of opportunity is. So I think go that is really probably the thing that drives success most. And going back to Cam, I think that's one of the things that allowed for him to do that at the last minute of a game, because that mindset was there, and he probably was more in a comfort zone in those, let's say, high stress scenarios than he was when we were up by 3 or 4 scores.
How do you train grit and resiliency? Those are two things that, no matter who you ask, those are so critical for success in life. Is there a way to train that resiliency?
I mean, I think as humans, we're born with varying levels of grit. And I think the way we can cultivate that is by embracing growth mindsets. And I think when we talk about growth mindsets, we're looking at things that can be developed, and can we continue to improve. And I think part of that is looking at failures and setbacks as temporary, and really as opportunities to grow and improve. And I think um, you know where we can start to demonstrate persistence, and really those are some of the things that I think are tied in with, let's say, training grit or training mindset. I think, for example, let's say, we're going in and we don't get that promotion. Good. We have more time to get better. We have more time to improve and do things at a different level. So I think we really have to embrace failure as an opportunity to improve. And that to us, is how we really emphasize that grit, with our program and with our, not only our athletes, but our staff as well. When something doesn't go well, good, get better.
Yeah, I think you just covered my next question, which is, life is a series of challenges for all of us, no matter who you are. And you just talked about, my question was going to be, what kind of strategies do you have so that the people that you work with bounce back from setbacks and they utilize failures as opportunities for growth? And I think you said it best. It's success is not about failure, it's about how you deal with failure. And I think that's such an important thing to realize, that you can't look at these setbacks as the end. It's just an opportunity to get better. So, really, really well said. Another key topic is burnout, which a lot of people feel. What do you recommend as strategies to avoid burnout? You have all these athletes that are going 110% every single day, and obviously at some point you need a break. What are strategies to prevent that burnout?
Yeah, I think creating clarity in what your goals are. I think it's oftentimes it's part of that is creating limitations as well. So creating clarity and creating limitations. I think a lot of times it's counterintuitive, but limitations really create some freedom, because when, let's say, our staff knows that, let's say, strengthening our data collection processes is a top priority, they can innovate and work on that specific area without constantly second guessing whether they're doing enough or doing things that maybe I'm looking for. So I think that's really part of it, is that clarity and setting limitations. um, for me, what I found is the best way to avoid burnout is by declining opportunities that really don't align with what my current priorities are. And whether that's working with a team or engaging in, let's say, a supplement or whatever it might be. I think for me, declining those good opportunities, although might be something we do in the future, at that time it really doesn't align with what my priorities and needs are. So that to me has been one of the best ways to avoid burnout and really manage some of what can potentially be an overwhelming day for us here at the U.
I'm going to ask you about a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart because I'm a big fan. But what are your thoughts on cold plunging?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of some of these alternative methods for not only improving recovery but improving performance. I think cold water immersion is a simple tool for improving physical and mental health. I think cold water immersions, um, got let's say a profound impact on dopamine, and I think that neurotransmitter. It's important for mood regulation, motivation, focus, like getting into kind of the physiology of brown fat. Our body is able to process um, a lot differently when exposed to temperature. And I think cold plunging and cold water immersion are really they're fascinating effects that you can get from doing that. And you can go for 5 minutes of cold water immersion and see an increase of probably 200%. In terms of dopamine, and I think the depending on how long you're in that cold water for, the effects can last 5 to 8 hours a day. So I'm really a big fan of cold water immersion.
Yeah, I always tell people it's the most horrific and the most amazing thing you'll ever do.
Yeah.
I do it every morning, and I've been doing it now for a year and a half, and I'm still terrified every single morning. But no, it's amazing. I think it has such long lasting effects, and I think all the physical stuff, now we're getting data on it, but the mental aspect for me is what's most important. The fact that you're every day overcoming something that 99% of society doesn't want to do. I think it's pretty powerful. Last question, because I know you're super busy, Eric, but what is the most important take home recommendation for any of our listeners that hear this and say, okay, I want to achieve peak performance? Just last highest recommendation you would have.
I'd say focus on the process, not the outcome. I think that's probably the biggest bit of advice I can give for anyone, chasing high performance, whether that be business, academics, sport, medicine, whatever that might be. I think for me, it's a simple thing to say, but it really is the most impactful way to sustain motivation towards that goal.
Yeah, I think you're dealing at the U with just the highest focus driven athletes on the planet. And I think it's not about athletes. It's about getting up, knowing what you want, being disciplined and focused on getting there. And I think, like you said, focus on the process, not necessarily the outcome, because it is a long process. And I think it was Ray Lewis who said that greatness is always evolving and it's day after day after day, and you got to put in the work. And I think, yeah, Ray Lewis is arguably the best linebacker of all time, but that applies to all of us. And I think every day it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And I think being focused on all the topics that you mentioned is a great first step.
Agreed. I mean, I think the goal that's set and the outcome that we're going to achieve from that goal, really, it all breaks down to what we're doing to achieve that, and that process is critical.
Eric, thank you so much for your time. Good luck with the Hurricanes. I know a lot of big expectations this year coming up, and thanks to all your work that you do with the team.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor.
All right, buddy. Take care.
Thank you.